I can still see it like it happened yesterday. The swing was moving back and forth, squeaking on its chains, but the seat was empty. I was only a few steps away, phone in my hand, and it took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. My mind refused to accept it. For a split second I kept seeing the picture I knew so well, my little Mikey laughing, stretching out his hands, asking me to push him higher. But he wasn't there. The swing was empty. His name burst out of me before I even knew I was speaking. I shouted once, then again, my voice sharper and higher than I ever heard it before. Nothing, just the sounds of the playground, kids yelling, the thud of a basketball hitting the pavement, a dog barking behind the fence. I turned and saw Sophie, my daughter, dropping down from the monkey bars, her eyes wide with confusion. She whispered, almost like she didn't want to hear herself say it. He was just here. 10 minutes earlier, everything was so normal. It was a Saturday morning, warm sunlight pouring through the kitchen window. I was flipping pancakes, the smell of coffee filling the room. Mikey's fingers were sticky with syrup. Sophie was carefully writing her spelling words in a notebook. We had this tiny little world of ours after the divorce. It was cramped, it was messy, but it was ours. No late nights waiting for a husband who never came home on time. No slammed doors rattling the glass, no words sharp enough to slice through the walls. I had left David on my own. He told me I'd regret it, said walking out was the biggest mistake of my life. He never liked to lose, not in business, not in arguments, not even at dinner parties where every conversation was a contest. The idea that I could quietly pack up, take the kids, and rent a little townhouse in the suburbs, that was something he couldn't process. I still remember the courthouse hallway, his voice low and cold as he gave me that empty smile. You'll be back. With the kids or without them, you'll come back. Because without me, you won't make it. At the time, I almost laughed at how pathetic it sounded. But standing there by that empty swing, his words came rushing back to me like ice water down my spine. I felt the phone pressing into my palm so hard my fingers turned white. My heart was pounding against my ribs, breath coming short and shallow like I'd been running. Sophie's eyes locked on mine. She was only 7, her lips trembling, but there was something steady in her gaze too, something that made me realize she was ready to stand with me if I fell apart. And that thought broke me a little more. I was supposed to be her strength. Everything around me, the chatter of other kids, the smell of fresh-cut grass, even the cotton candy from the food truck at the corner, felt strange, out of place, almost fake. The only thing that was real was the empty swing, swaying in the wind, and the feeling that my life had just been split in two. With the kids or without them, you'll come back to me, because without me, you won't survive. That's what David told me in the courthouse hallway. And you know what? At the time, I almost laughed. I thought, survive what? I was already surviving. Barely maybe, but I was. Sophie had gotten used to the new bus route to her school. Mikey was adjusting to his new preschool. Little by little, we were breathing again. For the first time in months, I could close my eyes at night and actually sleep, not half awake, waiting for a fight to start or a door to slam. I didn't realize how heavy that constant tension had been until it was gone. But of course, his mother wasn't going to let me enjoy that peace. Mrs. Eleanor had her way of talking, in that sharp little whisper that somehow carried across an entire room. She knew how to humiliate me without ever raising her voice. At church, she'd say, "Those kids are always hungry." At the grocery store, she'd shake her head and tell a neighbor, "Janet's never on time to pick Sophie up from practice." And Sophie, poor thing, would come home with those wide, scared eyes, asking me, "Grandma says you're not a good mom. Is it true?" I'd kneel down, hold her face in my hands, and say what I had to. "Grandma's angry right now. People get angry, but I am a good mom." I said it like a prayer, over and over, as much for myself as for her. The truth was, David wasn't letting go. Not of me, not of the kids. He kept filing motions in court, bringing in these stacks of printouts, trying to prove I was losing control, that I was too tired, too weak, too distracted to raise them. And every time we sat across from each other at those hearings, he had that same calm arrogance, like he was sure the law would bend his way. I'll never forget the last meeting before everything blew up. He leaned in close, so close I could smell his cologne, and in that low voice he said, "The kids need to live with me. That's the only way you'll stop fighting me. That's the only way we'll be a family again. Then you'll stop resisting. We'll be a family again." That's what David told me, leaning in so close I could feel the weight of his words more than I could hear them. I didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. I simply turned and walked away, carrying the silence with me, believing for a moment that I had left his shadow behind. That morning had started like 100 mornings before, and maybe that's what makes it so cruel in my memory, because it was filled with such ordinary sweetness. Mikey sat cross-legged on the rug, lining up his dinosaurs and making them roar, so proud of himself when he gave them little battles, while Sophie sat at the kitchen table with her pencil pressed tightly in her hand, carefully writing the word bravery, one syllable at a time, as if she understood already how much weight that word would carry for us. I poured their juice into mismatched cups, tied Mikey's sneakers with the flashing lights, and we left for the park with the sun bright and the air sharp with the smell of early autumn leaves. It was just the park, just a Saturday morning filled with strangers' laughter, parents on benches clutching travel mugs, toddlers chasing bubbles, teenagers zipping by on scooters, and it felt so safe that I let myself breathe, maybe too deeply, because for the first time in a long while, I believed that the three of us had managed to carve out something normal. I strapped Mikey into the toddler swing with the heavy buckle across his lap, the kind you almost need 2 hands to snap into place, and I sent Sophie running toward the jungle gym, watching her climb with the fearless energy I used to think only belonged to boys. My phone buzzed, and it was my half-brother calling about Dad's surgery, telling me they had moved it to Tuesday. I walked just a few steps to the bench, still facing Mikey, explaining into the phone that rescheduling was routine, that more time for tests and prep would help, and I remember the way my voice sounded calm and logical even though I was half distracted by the sight of my little boy swinging in the corner of my eye. 90 seconds. I know, because later I checked the call log again and again, tracing every second like it could give me back what I had lost. When I looked up, the swing was empty. I froze, my body refusing to move because it didn't make sense, and my mind still showed me the picture of him laughing there, holding out his arms, but the only thing in front of me was the seat rocking back and forth, with a hollow creak. Sophie ran toward me with her lip caught between her teeth, whispering that sometimes he tries to climb out, but not from this swing, not from one with a safety bar he couldn't undo. That's when my eyes landed on the strap, the thick buckle I knew I had snapped tight, now hanging loose on one side like someone had unfastened it on purpose, and the world tilted around me as I whispered the word help, but it came out too steady, too flat, as if I hadn't yet understood that everything I loved was suddenly at risk of disappearing forever. And then the noise of the playground swelled around me in a blur, mothers jumping from benches, fathers running toward the bathrooms, teenagers dropping their scooters to look behind slides, voices calling out his name even though mine was the only voice he knew would matter, but I didn't hear them clearly. I only heard the swing creaking against its chains and the roar of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and in that moment, I knew my life had split into 2 pieces. The before that I had taken for granted, and the after that I wasn't ready to face. He was 3 years old. Green t-shirt with a dinosaur across the front, little blue shorts, sneakers that lit up when he ran. His name was Mikey, my Mikey. He had been right there 1 minute ago. I could still see him in my mind, laughing, legs kicking, hair flying in the air. And then he was gone. It was like the whole playground moved in unison once they saw my face. Parents shot up from benches. One man sprinted toward the slides, another toward the bathrooms. A young dad asked if there was water nearby, and instantly a cold picture cut through my brain. The pond at the far end of the park, hidden behind the trees, the place where ducks swam in the summer. I felt my knees weaken just thinking about it. Then a woman touched my shoulder and said softly, "I'll check the parking lot." I nodded because my voice wouldn't work, my throat locked tight. and all I could do was cling to my phone like it was the last solid thing in my hands. I dialed 911, and the dispatcher's voice was calm, almost too calm, as if she didn't understand that my world was burning down in that moment. I gave his description, stumbling but precise, and while I spoke, my eyes kept sweeping the ground, searching for anything that might tell me where he went. A toy car abandoned in the sand, the faint pattern of sneaker prints, a sticker slapped onto the fence that maybe he would have stopped to touch. Nothing matched, nothing gave me hope. Sophie stayed close, but she wasn't crying. She was quiet, tense, her small hand balled into a fist the way she always did when she was concentrating hard. Finally, she looked up at me and said, "Mom, can I stay by your side and just watch? I remember how he runs. I know the way he moves. I'll keep looking." And my heart broke at the steadiness in her voice, because she was 7 years old and already offering to carry the weight I should have been strong enough to hold alone. The minutes stretched and collapsed all at once. 12 minutes later, the sirens came, but to me it felt like both forever and no time at all, like I was trapped in a nightmare where the clock mocked me. First there was only silence, then the rising wail of the squad car. And in that sound I realized for the first time that this wasn't just a scare, wasn't just a game of hide and seek gone too far. This was real. My little boy was gone, and nothing in my life would ever be the same again. 2 officers arrived, their radios crackling, their questions clipped and fast. His name, his age, what he was wearing, how long he'd been gone. I answered in fragments, my throat raw, and before I could even catch my breath, I saw it. The shine of a luxury car pulling up to the curb like something out of a commercial. And stepping out was David, my ex, with his mother Eleanor right behind him, her body stiff and tight like a pin stuck into fabric. They both wore that look I knew too well, the expression that always said, "We'll explain everything. We'll spin it our way." Before the officers even finished writing in their notepad, David was already talking, his voice sharp and polished, asking how I could possibly lose a child, asking where I was, accusing me of being on my phone again like always. It was the kind of performance he had mastered years ago, and hearing it there on that playground made my skin burn. I forced myself to answer, though the sound of my own voice startled me because it didn't feel like mine anymore. I told him to help, to actually search instead of talk, and he nodded with that perfect show of control, saying he would, saying in front of everyone that the children belonged with him, that their lives were in danger if they stayed with me. The officer gave him a quick look, one I couldn't read, but it felt like slamming into a wall. A flicker of judgment that left me trembling, unsure which way his thoughts were tilting. Eleanor wasted no time either. While David postured for the police, she leaned close to another mother on a bench, whispering just loud enough for others to hear, her words slicing through the air. "I warned you, she's not fit to raise them." I wanted to scream, but my body stayed frozen, every nerve lit up and useless. David turned to Sophie and told her to sit down, pointing at a nearby chair with that cold authority he carried like a badge. But Sophie didn't move. She stayed right beside me, standing tall in her little sneakers, and for the first time that day, I felt something break through the terror, the fragile relief that at least my daughter still believed in me. My phone buzzed again, an unknown number flashing across the screen. I hit decline without thinking. This wasn't the moment for strangers, for any voice but my own child's. Still, a strange thought crawled up inside me, sticky and cold. What if this wasn't an accident? What if this whole nightmare was exactly what he wanted? The idea lodged itself deep, refusing to leave, and as I stood there surrounded by flashing lights and cold stares, I realized with a clarity that chilled me to the bone, this wasn't just bad luck. This was a plan. David had been saying it for months. The kids should live with him. I would come back eventually. There was no other way. His words echoed in me as I stared at the swing that had finally gone still, the creak of its chains fading into silence. That empty seat marked the line in my life, the before and the after. Before was pancakes with sticky fingers and coffee warming the kitchen windowsill. After was sirens, notepads, and the sound of my daughter's voice, steady and clear, cutting through the fear. "Mom, Sophie said, lifting her chin in that way she did when she wanted to look braver than she felt. I know where to look. Please don't be mad. I'm going to tell them. She left my side and walked straight to the officer, her little shoulders squared, and in that instant I felt both pride and dread, because I knew she had seen more than I realized. A few minutes later, after hushed words and quick notes, the officers told us to come with them. The station felt colder than the fall air outside. The fluorescent lights glared down like interrogation lamps in an old movie, white walls closing in, the stiff metal chair biting into my back, the smell of cheap coffee turning my stomach. I laced my fingers together so tightly on my knees I could barely feel them, just to keep the shaking from showing. Across from me, the lieutenant typed at his computer without looking up, the clicking keys slicing through the silence. And then there was David, pacing the room like it was his stage, like he owned the air we were breathing. In his hand, he carried a stack of papers, the custody petition he had filed the day before, waving it like it was his ticket to victory. He raised his voice, loud enough for everyone, announcing that he had warned them already, that I was unstable, unfit, unreliable. He brandished the document as though it proved his prophecy, that the children belonged with him, and this disappearance was only the proof they needed. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand how he could stand there and turn my nightmare into his performance. But my throat burned, and the words stayed locked behind my teeth. All I could do was sit there, watching his confidence fill the room, the smug certainty in his eyes, while the man who had promised me once that I would never survive without him used my missing child as a weapon to destroy me. David turned to the officers with his papers in hand and said it like a lawyer making his case, and now the child is gone. A coincidence? I snapped my head up and looked straight at him, the disbelief cracking through my exhaustion. David, are you serious? Your son is missing, and you're standing here staging a performance? My words came out harsher than I intended, but I couldn't believe he was twisting this nightmare into a script he had written long before. He smirked at the word missing and tossed it back at me as if it were an exaggeration. Missing is too strong, he said, almost casual. And then with a flick of his hand toward his mother, he added, she knew you would win in court, so she decided to hide him, to keep him from you. His voice was sharp, rehearsed, almost triumphant, and my stomach dropped because I realized he wasn't panicking like I was. He was calculating. I stood so fast, my chair screeched, fury shaking through me, but before I could step closer, the lieutenant raised his hand and ordered me back down, his face stiff and unreadable. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her back rigid, her lips curling into that thin, icy smile I had hated since the first year of my marriage. She didn't even flinch as she said it, her tone flat like a diagnosis. I've always said Janet couldn't handle it. She has meltdowns, she doesn't know how to care for children, and now look, here's the proof. Her words sliced through me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, the pain pressing so hard into my chest, I thought I might collapse right there. Finally, the lieutenant lifted his eyes from his screen and looked at me. His voice was dry, bureaucratic, but every syllable weighed heavy. Do you understand the seriousness of this situation? Your child has been gone 3 hours. Every minute could be critical. If you're hiding something, now is the time to tell us. His words hung in the air, daring me to confess to something I didn't even understand, and I shook my head hard enough to feel it in my neck. I'm not hiding anything, I managed, my voice trembling but firm. I told them the truth, the only truth I had. We were at the park. I had answered a call from my half-brother about Dad's surgery being rescheduled. 90 seconds, that's all. When I looked back, the swing was empty. My life unraveled in that sliver of time, and yet here I was, being painted as the villain, while the man who should have been out there searching stood in front of me, turning my grief into his evidence. When I turned back, my son was gone. That was the whole truth, as simple and brutal as that. But David leaned against the table, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Convenient, isn't it? A phone call nobody else heard, a child vanishing in 90 seconds flat. Too many coincidences. His words were like acid poured straight into my ears. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white. I told them there were people in that park, people who had seen me searching, who had helped me call his name. But Eleanor slipped in with that calm, poisonous tone of hers, suggesting I had staged it all, that I had manipulated strangers to back me up. "You've always been good at playing the victim," she said, her lips curling like she was savoring each syllable. The room spun around me, my lungs tight, because I realized these two weren't panicked about a little boy alone in the cold. They were focused only on destroying me. Their words didn't sound like fear, they sounded like strategy. They didn't picture Mikey out there crying, shivering, calling for me. They pictured themselves standing in this very room, building their case brick by brick, hammering each accusation into my chest until it bled. I wanted to scream that they were wasting precious time, that every second was slipping through our fingers, but the lieutenant's steady gaze pinned me in place, like he already had an answer in mind. "Do you have financial problems? Debts?" His voice was flat, clinical, but it carried the weight of judgment. My throat tightened and I forced the words out. "All I have is my job and my children. We live simply, but my kids have everything they need." Even as I spoke, my voice betrayed me, trembling, cracking in places I couldn't hold together. David stepped forward, seizing the crack like it was his victory. "She's unemployed. She just burns through the child support," he declared, his tone cold and rehearsed, and I could feel the heat of shame rising up my neck even though I knew it was a lie. In that moment, sitting in that harsh light, I realized they weren't just trying to take my children. They were trying to erase me piece by piece, until nothing of me remained but the story they wanted to tell. David's voice cut through the air, sharp and cruel. "She needed money, so she—" That was all I could take. I shot up from my chair, my voice breaking as I shouted, "Enough! I am a mother. My son has been missing for 3 hours, alone God knows where, and instead of helping me, you—" But before I could finish, the lieutenant slammed his finger against the table, his eyes narrowing as he barked, "Quiet. Emotions help no one here." The sound silenced the room, but my blood still thundered in my ears. David folded his arms across his chest, the picture of smug control, and cast his gaze toward Sophie. "Sit still, Sophie," he commanded, his tone dripping with authority. "The adults are talking." My daughter didn't move. She clutched her worn little stuffed bunny tight to her chest, her eyes darting between me and her father, not with the confusion of a child but with something deeper, sharper. In that moment, I saw it. She had been listening, she had been watching, she had been piecing it all together like a puzzle. I wanted to whisper, "Don't be afraid," but the words caught in my throat. The silence grew heavy, sticky, filling every corner of the room. I could sense the lieutenant leaning closer to David's version of the story, could see it in the exhaustion around his eyes, the way his pen lingered above the page. David's false, paternal smile spread across his face like a mask, and Eleanor shifted nearer to him, their unity forming a solid wall against me. And then, out of nowhere, Sophie lifted her head. Her voice was small, but unwavering, and it sliced through the stillness like glass shattering on tile. "That's not true." The entire room froze, even the scratch of the lieutenant's pen halted mid-stroke. My daughter's words hung in the air, delicate but unshakable, and in that fragile second, the entire balance of the room shifted. David was the first to move, his performance skills kicking in instantly. His tone softened, slipping into that practiced warmth I knew so well, the voice he used to charm waiters and win over judges. "Sweetheart, calm down," he said, a gentle smile plastered across his face. "Don't interrupt, just go along." But I could see the flicker of panic beneath his eyes, the crack in his mask, because he knew Sophie wasn't playing his game anymore. "Sweetheart, don't interrupt the adults," David told her, his voice dripping with that false patience he always used when he wanted to control the room. But Sophie didn't sit back down. She stood, small and wiry, clutching her stuffed bunny so tight her knuckles turned white. Her whole body looked fragile, curled in on itself, yet her voice came out strong enough to slice through the air. "Daddy is lying. I know where Mikey is." The air in the room shifted, heavy and sharp, as if half the oxygen had been drained away. David's face lost all its color, and for a brief second, even Eleanor's eyes widened with something close to fear. He stepped toward Sophie, his voice trembling as he said her name. "Sophie, this isn't the time." But my daughter cut him off, lifting her chin, placing a crumpled piece of notebook paper on the table with shaking hands. "I'll show you," she said. The lieutenant frowned, his brow furrowing as he picked up the sheet. It was lined paper, covered in rough crayon marks of purple and green, jagged lines and scribbles that looked like a child's game, until you realized what it really was. "What is this?" he asked, his tone shifting. Sophie's voice wavered, but she pushed forward anyway. "It's a map," she explained carefully, like she had practiced the words in her head 100 times. "Yesterday, Daddy played a secret game with Mikey. He told him that when we went to the park, Mikey should run to Uncle Mike's car and climb in when Mom wasn't watching. Then they'd take him to the cabin by the lake." The room went silent, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead the only sound. David snapped, his mask slipping as his voice cracked into a near shout. "That's ridiculous. She's making it up. She's 7 years old. She has an imagination." But Sophie stood her ground, lifting her chin higher, her small hands trembling but steady in her conviction. "It's not a story," she said, firmly. "He made Mikey practice 3 times in the yard. Every time, he gave him a chocolate bar as a prize." Sophie's words came out like she had rehearsed them in secret, each one deliberate. "He gave Mikey a chocolate bar every time. He told him if he did it right, Mommy would come back home." The lieutenant's eyes shifted to David, waiting. The room held its breath. David's mask cracked wide open. His voice was sharp now, full of steel, no longer pretending to be calm or reasonable. "That's absurd. She's just a child. She's making up stories. Janet fed this to her, twisted her mind. That's all this is." His tone rattled against the walls, desperate and trembling beneath the anger. But Sophie didn't back down. She looked straight at Eleanor, her voice steady, even as her little hands clutched the stuffed bunny. "I heard you, Grandma, on the phone. You said once the kids are with you, Mom won't have anywhere to go. She'll have to come back. I was sitting on the stairs. I heard every word. My chest seized hearing it, because I remembered that night too. The hushed voices, the way Sophie had been too quiet afterward." Eleanor shot up from her chair, her face flushed red with fury. "You lying little girl, how dare you?" she began, but the lieutenant raised his hand, cutting her off, his eyes fixed on Sophie. His voice softened when he asked, "Sweetheart, can you tell me where this cabin is?" Sophie nodded without hesitation. "Yes. Lakewood Lake, cabin number 12. We were there when Dad took us fishing." The room sank into a heavy silence, every breath caught in place. I could only hear my own heartbeat, pounding so loud it drowned everything else. David lunged a step closer to Sophie, but the officer stepped in front of her, his voice firm. "That's enough." Sophie looked back at me, small, clutching her toy, but her eyes blazed with the very words she had written that morning in her notebook. Bravery. "Mom," she whispered, "he wanted us all to stay with him forever. He thought if he took Mikey, you'd have to come back. That was his way." I buried my face in my hands, the weight of it crashing over me, because in that moment I realized my 7-year-old daughter had carried the truth I hadn't wanted to see, and she had been the one strong enough to speak it when I couldn't. The world tilted beneath me, because if Sophie had found the courage to speak it out loud, then the truth was finally in the open, no matter how much they tried to bury it. The lieutenant's phone buzzed with a sharp ring that sliced through the tension, and he pressed it to his ear, listening silently. His face shifted in an instant, the guarded suspicion hardened into something cold, focused, immovable. "It's confirmed," he said flatly. "A unit is already at the cabin on Lakewood Lake. The child's been found." For a heartbeat I couldn't move, and then the words sank in. Found. Alive. My knees nearly gave out under me, tears streaming as I buried my face in my hands. "Mikey is alive," I kept repeating inside, clutching the thought like a lifeline. My baby was alive. David shot up from his chair, his mask slipping but not shattering, his face pale and slick with sweat. "I demand my son be returned to me immediately," he barked, his voice straining for authority he no longer had. The lieutenant's response cracked like a whip. "Sit down. Your demands aren't worth a dime now." David froze, his jaw twitching, the room no longer bending to him. The door banged open, and a sergeant entered with a folder tucked under his arm. He spoke briskly, his words punching through the air. The boy was found in the cabin with a woman who claimed she was a friend of David's. She told officers he had asked her to watch Mikey for a few days, assuring her that the mother had given permission. She was in shock when she learned the boy had been reported missing. David's face drained to a sickly gray as he shouted, "That's nonsense! A misunderstanding!" His words cracked, the polished performance gone. But the lieutenant cut him off, his voice like stone. "A misunderstanding? You orchestrated this to paint your ex-wife as unfit. You wanted the court to hand you the children. The truth lay naked in that room, no longer mine alone to carry, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight begin to lift." Eleanor clutched at her chest, her voice sharp and defiant. "Don't you dare. My son only wanted what was best. That woman ruined him, she abandoned him, and now she's turning the children against their own father." Her words dripped with venom, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. But Sophie didn't waver. Her little voice trembled, but her eyes stayed fixed on her grandmother. "Stop it, Grandma. I saw you writing everything in your notebook. I saw the plan, about Mikey, about how Mom can't handle us." The lieutenant's head snapped up at that word, notebook, and my heart stuttered because I'd heard whispers about it too. Eleanor's so-called record book she carried everywhere, where she scribbled every imagined failing of mine like ammunition for a war she was already fighting. Sophie moved with quiet determination, stepping toward her grandmother's handbag. Her small hand slipped inside and pulled out the dark leather journal Eleanor never let out of her sight. Sophie set it down on the table with a heavy finality. "Here, open it." The lieutenant flipped through page after page, his brow rising higher with each line he read aloud. Plans written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Stage the boy's disappearance. Blame Janet for negligence. File for custody. Push her to the breaking point until she comes back. Each word struck like a hammer, each sentence colder than the last. I could hardly breathe, my lungs refusing to work as I listened to the proof laid bare in black and white. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It wasn't just my word against theirs. It was their own voices on paper, their conspiracy detailed with chilling precision. I sat frozen, tears burning my eyes, because even after everything, even after David's threats, I never imagined they would write it all down like this. Even I hadn't expected to see it spelled out so clearly, every scheme laid bare in black ink. Eleanor lunged forward, her voice breaking as she shouted, That's just a draft. Just thoughts on paper, nothing more." But the lieutenant didn't flinch. His reply was cold and clipped. "Thoughts like these are enough to put you behind bars." He gave a quick nod to the sergeant, and the room filled with the metallic snap of handcuffs. They went on David first. He jerked violently, shouting that it was all a setup, that I had invented everything, that nothing could be proven. His voice was shrill, desperate, cracking under the weight of the truth he could no longer control. But the lieutenant cut him off, calm and certain. "We can prove it. We have the child, we have the testimony of your daughter, and now we have this notebook." His words echoed like a verdict before the trial even began. Eleanor rose stiffly from her chair as if the ground had turned to fire beneath her feet. Her hands shook as the cuffs closed around her wrists. "You can't do this. I'm his grandmother. I was only protecting my grandchildren," she cried, but the sergeant's reply cut straight through. "Protecting them? You nearly shattered their lives." The truth of it burned into the room, and she had no answer left. I didn't hear the rest of what was said, not really. The voices blurred, the clink of metal fading into the background. What I heard instead were footsteps, light and fast, running down the hallway. Then a small voice, high, bright, achingly familiar. "Mommy." I leapt to my feet just as the door burst open, and there he was, Mikey, my little boy, his face sticky with melted ice cream, his sneakers flashing red and blue with every step, his shirt covered in smudges and stains. He flew into my arms, clutching my neck so tight it hurt, and I buried my face in his hair, breathing in the warm, sweet smell of him, the faint tang of apple juice clinging to his skin. "Mommy, Mommy," he cried, his voice breaking with relief. I was at the cabin. There were cats, 5 of them. I named them all Dinosaurs, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the lies, not the accusations, not the sound of David screaming behind me. All that mattered was the weight of my son against my chest and the pounding certainty that he was alive, safe, and finally back where he belonged. There were cats, Mommy, 5 of them. I called them Dinosaurs. That's what Mikey whispered into my neck, his little voice half proud, half tired, as if he didn't understand that his words were saving me from the darkest night of my life. I held him so tightly he squeaked, my tears running down onto his sticky cheeks, my arms trembling from the flood of relief, but I couldn't let go. Behind us I heard the heavy doors slam, the sound of metal, the chaos of voices as David and Eleanor were pulled in opposite directions, shouting that it was all a mistake, promising they would take the children back. Their cries echoed behind me, but I didn't turn. I looked at Sophie then. She was standing so still, clutching her stuffed bunny against her chest, and only in that moment did I see her small body start to tremble. She had held herself together through every word, through every lie thrown in our faces, but now the fear finally showed. I reached out my hand and whispered, "Come here, sweetheart. You saved us." She stepped closer, her eyes shining, and leaned in to murmur, "I only told the truth." And she was right. It was the truth, spoken by a child, that had been strong enough to bring their entire plan crashing down. The months that followed were a blur of courtrooms and hearings. David twisted every angle he could, hiring an expensive lawyer to paint the whole ordeal as a misunderstanding, claiming he had only been trying to help me, insisting I was overwhelmed and he had stepped in out of love. Eleanor sat at every session in a shoal, feigning weakness, coughing into her tissues, telling anyone who would listen that she had only ever cared for her grandchildren's safety. But lies crumble when held up to light, and the evidence was relentless. There was Eleanor's notebook, page after page of careful handwriting, outlining their plan to make me look unfit. There was Sophie's brave testimony, her words steady even as her small hands clutched her bunny on the stand. There was the police report, the details of their arrest, the discovery of Mikey in that cabin. And there was David's own acquaintance, the woman who finally admitted on record that he had asked her to watch Mikey, telling her I had agreed to it when I never had. The judge's gaze was cold, piercing as she looked at David over her glasses. "You are a grown man," she said, her voice sharp, deliberate, echoing through the courtroom. "And yet you involved a small child in a calculated scheme meant to harm his own mother. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was abduction." In that instant, I felt the truth land like a stone in the quiet air, undeniable, unmovable, a verdict that had been written long before the words were spoken. The judge's words rang out like a final bell. This was not a mistake. This was not a game. This was abduction. With that, David was sentenced. 2 years in prison for the kidnapping of his own son. Eleanor received probation as an accomplice, her pleas of frailty and innocence falling flat under the weight of her own notebook. For the first time in what felt like forever, I exhaled without fear. My chest felt lighter, as though someone had finally cut loose the anchor I had been dragging for years. The children stayed with me. The court sealed it in black and white. My home was their home, and any contact with their father would be strictly monitored by child services and the police. But the truth is, my kids didn't want those visits. Sophie told the therapist, her voice steady and clear, "I don't want to see Daddy until he understands we're not toys for him to use just to get Mom back." And even little Mikey, too young to grasp the full picture, clung to me whenever his father's name came up, whispering into my shirt, "Mom, I want to stay with you." Slowly, life began to feel like life again. I found a job at a private clinic as a nurse, with better pay and flexible hours that let me actually be present for my kids. We moved into a small house with a backyard garden, nothing fancy but ours, a place with sunlight on the porch and room to breathe. Sophie started tending flowers, proud of each little bloom she coaxed from the soil, while Mikey built garages for his toy dinosaurs out of cardboard boxes, lining them up in the grass as if he were creating a whole new world. The neighbors, an elderly couple with gentle smiles and open hearts, welcomed us like family. For Mikey, they became new grandparents, offering cookies and stories, while Sophie found in them a safe space to laugh again without the shadow of fear tightening her smile. I would catch myself watching them sometimes, my children playing freely, Sophie's laughter ringing without strain, Mikey's sneakers flashing in the dusk, and I realized the grip of the past was finally loosening. It wasn't gone. Maybe it never would be. But for the first time in years, the future didn't look like a battle. It looked like peace, fragile and precious, but real. Sometimes at night I still woke up gasping, haunted by the image of the park, the empty swing swaying back and forth, that hollow coldness spreading through my chest. But then I would turn and see my children sleeping safely beside me, their breathing soft and even, and I knew the nightmare was behind us. 6 months later, we went back to that same park. My hands shook as we walked through the gates, my stomach tight with nerves, but the kids begged me to go. Mikey scrambled back into the toddler swing, his laughter ringing through the crisp air as he shouted, "Mom, push me higher." Sophie ran to the monkey bars, the metal rattling as she lifted herself with confidence, her voice proud as she called out, "Look, Mom, I can flip all the way around now." I stood between them, watching their faces glow with joy, and I felt my heart settle into place again. The fear didn't vanish completely, but it loosened its grip, replaced by something steadier. My phone buzzed in my bag, and for an instant my whole body tensed. But before I could reach for it, Sophie called out, "Don't worry, Mom, we're right here. We're not going anywhere." Her words broke me open in the best way. I smiled through the tears because she was right. We were together, and nothing could pull us apart again. David's voice still slipped into my dreams sometimes, his threats echoing in the dark, but they came less and less often, fading like the shadow of a storm that had already passed. He had tried to force me back, to bend me with fear and manipulation, but in the end, he lost everything: his children, his freedom, and even the mask of control he had worn so long. And I, against all odds, had gained what mattered most: the certainty that truth is stronger than any lie, and that even the smallest voice, the brave words of a 7-year-old girl clutching her stuffed bunny, can unravel the most carefully built deception. If this story touched your heart the way it did mine, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps more people find these stories. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what part stayed with you the most, or maybe share something from your own life. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one that I can't wait to share with you.